Hey, good evening and welcome to the Mr. Brit Show on Resistance Radio. Thanks very much for tuning in this evening. That of course was Ministry with NWO, New World Order. Excellent track there. So how's it going this evening? It's damn cold up here, trying to keep warm. The weather's absolutely awful. I'm trying to get used to British prices. Haven't been overseas for the last 5 years. Everything seems to be a lot more expensive, so yeah, freezing cold and expensive. Welcome to Britain. And now of course we're isolated in Europe after David Cameron vetoed Angela Merkel's and Nicolas Sarkozy's plan to save the euro. They basically wanted to reopen the Lisbon Treaty, and Cameron was the only person to veto that in the whole of the EU. I'm trying to puzzle my way through this. It's quite a confusing one really, because I mean, on the surface, for people such as myself who are, you know, anti-globalist, anti-centralisation of power, then this ostensibly is a good thing, isn't it, to pull out of Europe? But, you know, is it really going to help the little people, me and you? Is it going to be in the interests of the British people? Of course, the line being pushed by Cameron and the Conservative Party is that this is in Britain's interests. But yeah, I mean, is it really in Britain's interests? You know, they wanted to basically Cameron wanted to get assurances from the other members of the Eurozone that the City of London was going to be safeguarded. So that certainly wasn't in the interest of me and you, was it? A defence of the City of London. You know, this was a defence of traders, of big business, of the very people who the Occupy movement are right now protesting against. And yeah, I mean, I'm just pretty dubious about the whole thing, you know. I mean, you could look at it as well that the euro is pretty much assured of failing, you know. It is collapsing. The euro dream was simply that, a dream. There was simply no way that these diverse countries could be brought together. And we've seen over the last year or so the fallout from this dream, which is the southern European nations, Greece, Italy, Spain, also Ireland of course. You know, they haven't been able to match the Germans in terms of budgetary discipline, yeah, in terms of controlling their economy. It was always going to be a failed project, so as it's going to fail, you know, Cameron's making quite a shrewd move there by distancing himself from the euro that is going to collapse. And, you know, I also have to say, I might be slightly more optimistic about this veto if the people who were running the country, who were running Great Britain, were good guys, and I had faith in the political system, and I had faith in these politicians like Cameron, and I actually believed that they had the interests of the British people at heart. But you'd have to be very foolish to think that our government has the interests of the people at heart. This government, which are, you know, massively slashing public services to pay off the banksters. They're basically in the pockets of the banksters. This system that we have of crony capitalism, where big corporations can simply lobby and bribe politicians to do what they want to do. And of course we also live under a completely warmongering regime that goes back to the last government, to the Labour government, Afghanistan, Iraq. But the Conservative Party have got off to a pretty good start, haven't they, with Libya, bombing the hell out of Libya those love bombs. So, it's not looking very good, is it, really? I, for one, don't have much hope in this government. I don't believe they have my interests at heart. I don't believe Britain is great, and I don't believe it's going to be great anytime soon, because the entire system is corrupt. The entire system is rotten. The entire system needs overhauling. We need to see justice again. We need to see a fairer system, and I'm sure you, like me, are trying to puzzle your way through this. It's such a complicated thing. It's difficult to come up with one solution because everybody's got, different ideas about what they would like to see. But I think that's something that's going to be worked through, and what we see with the London Occupy movement is the beginnings of a wide-scale movement against this system, which everyone can see now is totally corrupt. Not just radical activists, but the middle classes can now see this system for what it is. And I think this is the start of, hopefully, is going to be something that builds and builds. What the end is going to be, who can say, but interesting times. But also, of course, as I say every week, very dangerous times coming up. And the news stories this week have only served to confirm that Britain is going to be quite a tough place to live for the everyday man and woman such as me and you. There's been predictions of more riots in future, which is obvious. As the economic situation deteriorates, which it's going to do, that isn't me being a doom monger, a fear monger. That's simply a fact, isn't it? The national debt of Great Britain is £1 trillion, around £1 trillion, and that's just the official figure. There's simply no way out of this massive debt, this black hole of debt that we've been sucked into through years and years of reckless consumerism, through bank fraud, through the theft of the political and financial elite. There's simply no way this is going to be turned around anytime soon. And as I talked about last week, and as I'm doing myself, and as I hope the people listening to this are, it's time to prepare for these harder times that are coming as we move into what is effectively a depression. And you can just see a story every day about the situation that we're in Britain. Bad news everywhere you turn, really, so sometimes it's hard to try and keep positive through all this, but that's what we've got to do, really, isn't it? But more news stories this week about the millions of people who are turning to payday loans just to get by. These are the payday loans that you can get from these dodgy shops you see on the high streets. These really dodgy financial companies who will loan you smallish amounts of money at completely exorbitant interest rates. Credit cards and loans from banks are bad enough in terms of the interest you have to pay on them, but these places, these shops are quite obscene, really, sometimes in the amounts of interest that they do charge. I'll just pull up that story and tell you about that. I'm sure you've all read this yourself, but it's quite shocking when you read about how they totally rip people off. My computer's running a bit slow tonight, but I'll bring that up in a second. This was a headline from The Telegraph. Millions turn to payday loans just to get by. Just going to see if I can find the details there about the absolutely insane interest rates that people have paid. APRs of over 1,000%. Crazy stuff. And of course people are so desperate, people have bills to pay, that people do go to these shops. and you really can't blame people for doing that. You know, when you're in a really bad financial situation, you've got bills to pay, you need to put food on the table, and you can get your hands on a little bit of cash just to see you through, you know, the next few weeks or months or whatever, then it's very tempting to do that and to put off the repayment of that debt to the future. So yeah, I mean, as we've said before, you know, you have to try and avoid debt. I personally don't have any credit cards or loans. Luckily, I'm in a situation at the moment where I don't have to take out loans like this, such as from cash converters. That's one of the dodgy shops that I'm referring to there. But anyway, let me get on to some other stories tonight, because I'm going to be talking about Iran again. I did talk about Iran last week, but of course that's one of the biggest news stories in the news at the moment, and just been reading more about the situation with Iran today, and you know, really it's becoming clear in my mind that, you know, Iran is the target of the Anglo-American-Israeli empire. That's the number one target, isn't it? I re-listened to a video by Wesley Clark, the former 4-star US general, today, and reminded myself of the information that he revealed a few years ago about how a mere 2 weeks after 9/11 he was at the Pentagon, and another general basically told him that the plan was to take over 7 different countries in the next 5 years. And when you read the list of those countries, you know, certainly gives pause for thought. Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, Libya, Syria, and Iran. So Iraq, of course, is gone, and at the moment we see a lot of problems in Syria. You know, this all ties into this Arab Spring, and I don't claim to have all the answers about the Arab Spring. In fact, when the whole thing kicked off, I was actually one of the people who tried to not not dive into the whole conspiracy angle straight away. Maybe I was being slightly naive about that, I don't know, but I do like to try and have hope in humanity, and I do like to try and think that, you know, some revolutions are a spontaneous uprising of the people. And in terms of the Arab Spring, I mean, first we had Tunisia, and then we had Egypt, and there's been a lot of speculation about those two revolutions, and I know quite a few people listening to this, and some of the Resistance Radio hosts definitely think that Egypt was a contrived revolution to some extent. Of course, all of the people who were on the street, or most of the people on the street, were wanting change, wanting a regime change. You know, they were sick of Mubarak and the regime that was in power there. So when we talk about these contrived revolutions, we're not talking about loads of actors being on the street or anything ridiculous like that. But, you know, there's such a history of the West, of the US especially, and Britain, contriving revolutions, stoking revolutions, arming and funding the people who started those revolutions. And in terms of Tunisia and Egypt, well, I'm still on the fence about those two, I have to be honest. I mean, the main reason why is because in terms of the Egyptian revolution, I mean, Mubarak was in power, and he was really a perfect puppet for the Anglo-American Empire, you know. So I'm still trying to puzzle through in my own head why he would have had to have gone if this was, you know, if this was all contrived, basically, because he was a puppet, and he had been for a long time. And in terms of Egypt's relationship with Israel, well, the Israelis were very happy with Mubarak, because Mubarak signed a peace deal with Israel, and he was effectively a puppet of Israel. I mean, a story just came out this week relating to this. This was from, again, the Telegraph. The Independent. Israel fears the force of Arab Spring power shift. And this article details how Ehud Barak, the Israeli defense minister, is claiming to be very disturbed by what's happening in North Africa, in the Middle East. So much for Israel being pro-democracy. Here we have supposed democracies being set up in the Middle East. That's the it's the goal anyway. And Israel are talking that down, and worried about that. But yeah, I mean, in this article talks about Israel being very worried about Egypt, and the fact that sort of more extreme Islamists could take power in Egypt. So I mean, the question I'm asking in my mind is, if Egypt was part of this plot to dominate the Middle East, the plot that Wesley Clark talked about, how does that fit into it? Possibly it was just softening the ground for what we're seeing in Syria and what we could well soon see in Iran. Perhaps Tunisia and Egypt were contrived revolutions, but they were just to set the stage for the real targets, which are Syria and Iran. I don't know. But anyway, of course, after those two, we saw Libya, and I've no doubt in my mind that was very much a contrived revolution. I mean, I've detailed that in previous shows in depth about how the special forces were on the ground practically from day one, if not before. I mean, we don't know for sure, but we know that the SAS were there from the very, very early stages of that uprising in Benghazi, which was the pretext for the NATO air attacks on that country. That's how NATO was allowed to carry out their airstrikes on the country, because of the no-fly zone that was imposed over Libya, because Gaddafi was supposedly going to commit crimes against humanity by attacking civilians, these people who were uprising in Benghazi. And we saw how that played out. The SAS on the ground directing the NATO aircraft, the SAS forces also working with forces from other Middle Eastern puppet regimes. I believe forces were sent from Qatar, for example. So yeah, Libya obviously very much manipulated, very much part of this takeover of the Middle East. And of course now in Syria we've got loads of stuff going on there. And yeah, I've been listening to some of Webster Tarpley's stuff this week. Our regular listener Hulliam passed on a couple of videos that I checked out, and I mean, I don't know, I can't say whether this is what's happening, but Webster Tarpley basically spent a week in Syria, and Webster Tarpley claims that the images that we're being presented with of what's happening in Syria is radically different to what's actually happening on the ground. He claims that there isn't a civil war in Syria, that there are only very small pockets of resistance, very small groupings of opposition to the Syrian government, and even more kind of startling than that, Tarpley claims that the people who are actually fomenting this trouble in Syria are basically death squads working for the CIA. Tarpley claims that the black-clad snipers, who many people are terrified of in Syria, are working for the CIA. These snipers have been obviously shooting, just randomly killing men, women and children in Syria. Yeah, and Tarpley claims they're basically hired assassins. They're working for the CIA and are largely comprised of extremists, of Islamic extremists from I believe, well, I'm not sure actually where he stated that they come from. I can't quite remember, but yeah, he claims there are death squads anyway. And I mean, I wish he'd sort of filmed people talking about this. I've not seen any footage from Tarpley sort of recording what he found on the ground, but it certainly adds credibility to what he says, that he was actually there. He's not just some guy who's reading stuff on the internet and coming up with a conspiracy theory. He was actually there on the ground, so I mean that definitely adds weight to what he says. I don't know what you think about Webster Tarpley. I mean, I'm not sure myself. I mean, you've got to check it out for yourself, haven't you? He does come up with a lot of information, and I mean, yeah, I don't know how credible he is really, but it's certainly plausible that the CIA are behind this trouble in Syria. It very much fits the pattern of the destabilization campaigns that we've seen the CIA carry out before. I mean, most specifically in Central America, Argentina, for example, when there were CIA death squads on the streets causing chaos. I mean, that's the goal, isn't it? To just cause chaos, so then the people who want to take over that country can step in and take control. I mean, classic, divide and rule. You probably all remember in Iraq, in the early days of the invasion of Iraq, when there were 2 special forces troops captured I think it was in Helmand province, where the British were running Helmand province, and these 2 SAS special forces troops were dressed up with fake beards, driving around shooting things up, I believe, and all of the evidence points towards them being there to foment civil unrest. Very much, in the CIA style of doing things to do that. And of course, as I said at the beginning of the show, Iran really, is the end goal, isn't it? Iran is the defiant nation, and we all know what happens to defiant leaders, such as Gaddafi. We saw what happened to him. We all know what happened to defiant leaders, and especially defiant leaders who are sitting on so much oil, which is very much the case in Iran. You just have to look back to history to see the West meddling in Iran. We just have to go back to 1953 and the CIA coup in Iran. Basically, this was when the Brits and the Yanks fomented a coup because the guy who was in power at the time, Mohammad Mossadegh, he was going to nationalize the oil industry in Iran, which had previously been run by the Brits. This was a forerunner to British Petroleum called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company or something like that. And basically the Brits were like siphoning off all the profits I think the Iranians only got about 16% profits of their own oil supplies, and Mossadegh was democratically elected. He came to power. He wanted to put an end to this and, you know, get some money for his own country, for the people of his own country. What a terrible thing to do. The Brits and the Yanks, of course, weren't happy about this, so decided to get rid of him, and they did that by sending in CIA agents. The grandson of President Roosevelt was one of these, Kermit Roosevelt, a CIA agent who went into Iran, and, you know, similar to the scenes that we're seeing in Syria at the moment, riots were fomented, shootings, just general chaos. This was blamed on Mossadegh. Apparently the CIA had people running around causing this chaos, shooting people, claiming to be communists, and just saying they were like Mossadegh's forces, basically, to demonize him. And then once this chaos had been set off by the West, they installed their own man, who was the Shah, who ran Iran for the next couple of decades, well, until 1979, until he was overthrown. And apparently his regime was, you know, totally brutal, and really suppressed the rights of the Iranian people. So it's no wonder that the Iranians are defensive and worried about what the West is up to at the moment, because of exactly what happened in 1953. You know, we've got a track record not only around the world in terms of getting rid of people that we don't like in order to steal the resources, but in their own country we've done it before. You know, half a century ago, just over half a century ago. So who can blame the Iranians for being very wary about the intentions of the Brits and of the Yanks? And of course, we strongly believe that covert operations have been being carried out in Iran for some time. Recently we've had 2 explosions at nuclear sites in Iran. There was one just a couple of weeks ago, and I believe there was another one a few weeks before that, in which a number of revolutionary guards were killed. And, you know, all of the indications are this is covert, well, terrorism, isn't it? There's no other word for it. If we are sending people in, or, you know, possibly Israel, it could be the work of the Mossad. If people are being sent in there to blow stuff up and murder people in a sovereign nation who haven't done anything, then that's terrorism. There's no other word for it. And there's not only been this blowing up of sites believed to be related to the nuclear program, there's also been assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, you know, which is just disgraceful. Going into a country and just murdering scientists, you know. I mean, it's bad enough when politicians get assassinated, but these scientists, you know, they're not even politicians. They're professional scientists, and who knows what they're working on? You know, no one knows. Well, all of the evidence suggests that Iran isn't trying to develop a nuclear weapon. Anyway, I'm going to play a quick clip now of Seymour Hersh. Now, he's an independent Pulitzer Prize winning journalist from the US. I like his work. I've not actually read one of his books yet, but I would like to read it. That's the Samson option, which I've referenced in a couple of videos in the past. The Samson option, of course, is the policy that Israel has of massive nuclear preemptive strikes if they feel threatened by any surrounding country. So I will have to get a copy of the Samson option and give that a read. But this is Seymour Hersh talking about the Iranian nuclear program, because, as he details in this extract, the West has basically had a very, very close eye on Iran's nuclear program for quite a long time. Just put that on now.
Can you talk more about U.S. infiltration of Iran, JSOC in Iran, surveillance as well in Iran?
Sure. I mean, the kind of stuff they did. I could tell you stuff that that was secret 8, 9 years ago. We would, for example, we developed, if there was an underground facility we thought was where we saw some digging, let's say in a mountain area, we would line the road when there were trucks going up and down the road. We would line the road with what seemed to be pebbles. In fact, they were sensors that could measure the weight of trucks going in and out. If a truck would go in light and come out with heavy, we could assume it was coming out with dirt. They were doing digging. We did that kind of monitoring. We also put all sorts of passive counters, measures of radioactivity, uranium, even plutonium. Most of the stuff that's being done there is enriched uranium. They're not making plutonium. But you can track it. At certain points you have to move it. Once you take it out and start moving it around, you can track it. You can find the Geiger counters, if you will, to use that old-fashioned term. You can measure radioactivity and see increases. We would go into a building, our troops, sometimes even with Americans, go into a building in Tehran where we thought there was something fishy going on, start a disturbance down the street, take out a few bricks, slam in another section of brick with a Geiger counter, if you will, or a measuring device to see if in that building they were doing some enrichment we didn't know about. And we also have incredible competence at looking for air holes from the air, from satellites. If you're building an underground facility, you have to vent it. You have to get air into it. You have to find a way to remove bad air and put in fresh air. And so we have guys that are experts, tremendous people in the community. Some of them retired and set up a private company to do this. They would monitor all of the aerial surveillance to look for air holes so we could find a pattern, try to find a pattern of an underground facility. Nada. We came up with nothing. And the most important thing is we also, and the IA, even this new report also says, let me emphasize this, if you're not diverting uranium, if you're not taking uranium out of the count and smuggling it someplace so that you can build a bomb, and that the IAEA is absolutely categorical on everything that they are enriching, whatever percentage they enrich to is under camera inspection and under inspection of inspections. It's all open under the treaty, the Safeguard Treaty. Nobody's accusing Iran of violating the treaty. They're just accusing them of cheating on the side, or some evidence they are. And there's been no evidence of a diversion. So if you're going to make a bomb, you're going to have to bring it in from someplace else. And given the kind of surveillance we have, that's going to be hard to do, to import it from a third country, bring in uranium and enrich it, or enrich uranium. It's just a long shot. And what you have is, as I said, it's some sort of a hysteria that we had over Iraq that's coming up again in Iran. And this isn't a plea for Iran. There's a lot of things that the Iranians do that is objectionable, the way they treat dissent, etc., etc. So I'm just speaking within the context of the hullabaloo that's up now. And as far as sanctions are concerned, you know, excuse me, we've been sanctioning Cuba for 60 years, and Castro is, he may be ill, but he's still there. Sanctions are not going to work. This is a country that produces oil and gas, less and less, but still plenty of it, and they have customers in the Far East. The Iranians, they have customers for their energy. We're the losers in this.
So Seymour Hersh there, that was a clip from Democracy Now! So if you search Democracy Now! Seymour Hersh, that came out last month, and you'll find that pretty interesting stuff. And he's very clear there about the massive surveillance that the West has been running in Iran, even down to the extent of having pebbles on the roads towards suspected nuclear sites, pebbles which actually had inbuilt radiation detectors, and also about replacing bricks in buildings that were suspected of being part of the nuclear weapons program, which also contained radiation detectors. So the West has been monitoring Iran for quite some time in very close detail, and you know, there's literally no evidence that Iran is trying to develop a nuclear weapon. A lot of people believe that the program was ended in 2003. A lot of people believe that Iran did want to develop a nuclear weapon, but that simply wasn't to attack Israel or Europe with, but that was in case Iraq was developing a nuclear weapon. Iran were really worried that Saddam was developing nukes and that they were going to be put in danger by those nukes, and so they'd started to develop their own nuclear weapons program as a counter to that. But of course, when America and Britain invaded Iraq, got rid of Saddam, then they stopped that program because they they no longer had the fear that Saddam was going to develop nuclear weapons. So yeah, no evidence at all to suggest that Iran are developing these weapons, but it seems to be just assumed by Western leaders that that's what they're doing, even though they've denied it. I talked about this last week, but I can't really stress enough how totally messed up this whole situation is. I mean, we've got Britain and the US principally lecturing Iran about developing nuclear weapons, even though Iran hasn't attacked another country or hasn't invaded another country for, I believe, 200 years. They haven't threatened another country. Yeah, they've used rhetoric which is rather fiery and confrontational, but that's very different to being an existential threat to surrounding countries. And for Britain and the US to lecture Iran, when we look at the histories of Britain and the US, a bloody history in which millions of people have been killed through staged revolutions, through illegal invasions and occupations. How the hell can the British and the American governments lecture the Iranian government about how to behave? Double standards, total double standards. We seem to be in a position where we can lecture the world, or we think we're in a position where we can lecture the world, when we're in the worst position possible to do that, based on our bloody history. And when somebody stands up to the marauding forces of the West, well, they're accused of being a terrorist or other crazy things like wanting to nuke the West. Gaddafi is a good recent example. He stood up to the West and he was snuffed out pretty brutally, wasn't he? Absolutely insane. I'm just going to play another clip now, and this is a clip that Tom Secker has just written an article about. Tom Secker is the creator of a couple of good documentaries. He's a friend of Resistance Radio, and he's just set up a website that you can check out, which is called Investigating the Terror, investigatingtheterror.com. If you go there, you can check out Tom's work. And he forwarded me this video in which we see what an absolutely insane situation we're in. This was basically a public debate between Republican presidential candidates, and during this debate the candidates openly admitted that they wanted to run covert operations in Iran. I mean, it's just nuts when you hear it. Let me play that now for you.
Good evening from Wofford College in
The latest debate by the Republican candidates focused on the issue of the U.S. foreign policy, with Iran topping their discussion. They used the issue of Iran's nuclear energy program to unveil their virulent intentions against Tehran. Most of the candidates said if they get into the White House, they will try to confront Iran by trying to topple its government. To do so, some of them even went as far as saying they would resort to terrorism, systematic assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, and covert sabotage of the country's nuclear facilities.
Maximum covert operations to block and disrupt the Iranian program, including taking out their scientists, including breaking up their systems, all of it covertly, all of it deniable. Second, maximum coordination with the Israelis in a way which allows them to maximize their impact in Iran. Third, absolute strategic program comparable to what President Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Margaret Thatcher did to the Soviet Union, of every possible aspect short of war, of breaking the regime and bringing it down.
I disagree with Newt. As more sanctions and providing, more support for the pro-democracy movement isn't going to be enough in time. Read the IAEA reports. My final comment is we should be working with Israel right now to do what they did in Syria, what they did in Iraq, which is take out that nuclear capability.
Their blatant support for terrorism is in stark violation of international law and the UN Charter. But the threats of resorting to terrorism against Iran have already been a policy adopted by both the current and previous US administrations. Tehran says it has undeniable documents proving Washington's involvement in anti-Iran terrorist activities. One of the documents that Tehran has presented to the UN shows the US Central Intelligence Agency's top officials have held meetings with terrorist groups to assassinate 16 Iranian scientists. Iran has been accusing Washington of close ties with terrorist groups such as the MKO, PAJAK, and the Los Angeles-based Iran Royal Association, directing them to kill Iranian scientists or carry out terrorist operations inside the country. The US, along with Israel, also deployed the Stuxnet virus to cripple Iran's nuclear facilities, a move which failed to stop Iran's nuclear program. Washington has recently stepped up its anti-Iran stance, accusing Tehran of plotting terrorist attacks on its soil without providing any evidence. Tehran has denied the allegation as baseless and says it will provide the UN with its own documents on the US state-sponsored terrorism.
So that was a clip from Press TV, and the first speaker there was Newt Gingrich, the Republican candidate Newt Gingrich. And as the newsreader says, he was just, blatantly promoting terrorism, talking about running covert operations in Iran, which have been going on anyway, but, it's not even a secret anymore. They're quite blatant about the facts now, openly calling for the murder of scientists in Iran is terrorism. And another couple of things were mentioned there. The Stuxnet virus, that could also be seen as terrorism. This virus, which was, pretty much obviously created by Israel and the US to target the Iranian nuclear facilities, without any kind of thought as to what the consequences could be of this virus, could damage the systems, could cause radiation to leak, could injure and kill innocent people, but there's no thought for that at all. There was mention there as well of the groups that are being funded and supported by the West in Iran, including Islamic extremist groups, really extreme Islamic groups, the same kind of people who make up Al-Qaeda, in fact, because Iran's obviously a Shia dominated country and Al-Qaeda are Sunni, and the West, just as we've seen in Libya, are quite happy to use Islamic extremists to target another enemy. In Libya, the people that we were funding and supporting, the Libyan rebels, they were the same people who'd been killing American soldiers in Iraq, so-called Al-Qaeda. Just like the Islamic extremists were used in the 1980s in Afghanistan as a proxy force to push out the Russians. This is how the American government and the British government do business. They're quite happy to declare one group the enemy, and then the next decade they'll be using the exact same people who made up the group they declared the enemy to target another enemy. And that's what we see in Iran. Al-Qaeda type Islamic extremists being used to try and destabilize the Iranian regime, because that's the ultimate goal, the replacement of the Iranian regime with a puppet regime that's going to do what the West wants it to do. All of this talk about Iran's nuclear threat, it's just a pretext. I can't believe that politicians really believe that Iran is a nuclear threat. As I talked about earlier, there's no evidence to suggest that it is developing these nuclear weapons. In fact, some reports from the US, from the National Intelligence Assessment, I believe it's called, these are reports that are carried out by people in the intelligence community, high up in the intelligence community, and their reports have stated quite clearly that they don't believe Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon. In fact, this really pissed off the Bush government, for one. This isn't what they wanted to hear from their own intelligence community. They wanted a reason to attack Iran, but their own intelligence community was saying there's no reason because they're not developing this nuclear weapon. The Bush regime was really gunning for Iran. Another story that Seymour Hersh actually blew the cover on was Dick Cheney's plan to try and start a war with Iran. Now, his plan was to dress up some ships, I believe some speedboats, to make them look like Iranian speedboats, put some US troops on the speedboats but dressed up as Iranians, and then start a shootout in the Straits of Hormuz with an American ship to kick off an attack on Iran. I mean, that was openly discussed by Dick Cheney at the Pentagon. This is the kind of stuff these people do. They didn't carry out that plot, but it's quite obvious that other similar false flags have been carried out in the past. 9/11 being obviously the biggest one of those. Just because the Bush government are out of power doesn't mean at all that these plans are on hold in any way. The faces in power have changed, but the people pulling the strings are the exact same people who were in power during the Bush years, or the people who were behind the people in power during the Bush years. The people who made up the Project for a New American Century, the people who surrounded Zbigniew Brzezinski and his grand chessboard, they all have the same goal, and that goal is to dominate the Middle East, to take over those resources, to try and contain the other major powers in the world, Russia and principally China. Those plans haven't changed one bit. The US has got a black president now, but nothing's changed, has it, since Obama's come to power? The agenda's still the same, and it's a dangerous game. It could end up in World War III if Iran is attacked. What's China going to do? They're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior from the West anymore. They don't. They're powerful enough now to start pushing us back, China. They've got a massively powerful military. Economically, they're holding all the cards, basically, with the amount of US debt that they own. But these people who are in power, they're just psychopathic. they're not the ones that are going to suffer in any World War III situation. Might sound like conspiracy theory, but there's no doubt that these underground bases exist, and you can bet your life that the ultra rich who are pulling the strings of the puppet government own these things, and in the worst case scenario they could simply hide whilst the rest of us were basically frazzled. Of course, we've got Israel as well, the elephant in the room, who are fundamental to all of this, because this is a neocon Zionist plan to dominate the Middle East. Not only to get our hands on the resources, but to protect Israel. And in recent shows I've been talking about the Zionist infiltration of the British government. You know, at the very beginning of the show I was talking about Cameron's veto of this Eurozone plot to centralise power, and saying how ostensibly that could be seen as a positive thing, but to me, you know, it's really not a positive thing when you look at who is running the country and the fact that the government is infiltrated by Zionists and they are doing Israel's bidding. Doesn't inspire me with a whole load of confidence that pulling out of the EU even, which, you know, they haven't done yet, doesn't inspire me with confidence that that would actually achieve anything in terms of our safety, the safety of the regular people like me and you, who are always the people who suffer in war. It's never the elite, is it? It's always the everyday man and woman who suffers from war. Anyway, guys, I'm coming up to the end of the show. That went quite quickly, actually. I hope the sound is a bit better since I've got my new headset. And I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in. It's always appreciated. I will, as I did last week, upload this to YouTube with better quality sound. I'm going to put pictures and maybe video with the audio. It would be very much appreciated if you could share that video with your contacts on YouTube, if you could post it on Facebook or on Twitter. Help me to spread the information that I've talked about tonight. And as always, you can check out the website, resistradio.com. You can find the schedule there, links to the YouTube channels and websites of the hosts. If you would like to donate, if you appreciate the work that I do and would like to show that appreciation, buy me a pint. There is a PayPal button on there. That would be much appreciated. If you can't afford to, obviously don't. So thanks again, guys.